In this video we look at the biography of Alexander Sergeevich Pushkin. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video, and also write in the comments about whose biography to make a video about. Alexander Sergeevich Pushkin. Alexander Pushkin began writing his first works at the age of 7. During his years in the Lyceum he became famous when he read his poem to Gavril Derzhavin. Pushkin was the first Russian writer who began to earn his living by literary work. He created not only lyric poems, but also fairy tales, historical prose, and works in support of revolutionaries. The poet was even sent into exile for his free-thinking. From one extreme to the other. Alexander Pushkin was born into an impoverished noble family on June 6, 1799. In early childhood he was a taciturn and sedentary child. His older sister Olga recalled that up to 6 years a boy was just a sissy. Initial education Pushkin was at home. His upbringing was no different from the customary system then in noble families. His parents hired governesses and teachers from France, Germany, England and Russia. Education was given Pushkin hard, and teachers noted that he was not diligent. Soon, however, the boy was fond of reading. Spent sleepless nights and secretly devoured books one after another in his father's study. His younger brother Lev later recalled, "I don't know what will come out of my eldest grandson. The boy is clever and eager for books, but he studies poorly. Rarely when the lesson is passed in order, then he does not shake, do not drive to play with the children, then suddenly so turns and disperse, that nothing cannot pacify him. From one extreme to another rushes, he has no middle ground." Maria Hannibal. His love for reading grew into an attempt to create his own texts. Already at the age of 7, Pushkin was composing little comedies in French, imitating Molière. Later, after reading the works of La Fontaine, the young author wanted to write fables. And after getting acquainted with Voltaire's Henriade, Pushkin conceived a poem in 6 songs. All the books he read inspired the novice author. The origin of the writer and his African roots. Pushkin's mother, Nadezhda Osipovna, was the granddaughter of the famous Arab Peter the Great. Abram Petrovich Hannibal, an Abyssinian by birth, the future general-in-chief of the Russian service, was brought from Constantinople. At the will of the Tsar, Hannibal was baptized, trained as an engineer, and married to put down roots in Russia, twice. Hannibal had 11 children, but not all lived to adulthood. One of them, Osip, became the poet's grandfather. The time will come and Pushkin, piece by piece, will collect the family tree of his African ancestor, and make an attempt to immortalize his name in literature. Peter the Great's Arab is an unfinished historical novel that describes the traditions of Peter the Great's era against the background of a fictionalized romantic story of Abram Hannibal's marriage. During Pushkin's lifetime, only 2 selected excerpts. A curious fact, in Ethiopia, the homeland of Peter the Great's Arabist, Alexander Sergeevich is revered as a national pride. There is Pushkin Square in the capital, Addis Ababa, and his bronze bust is installed at the gate of the National Museum. Frenchman at the Tsarskoye Selo Lyceum. In 1811 Pushkin's parents decided to send their son to the Jesuit college, but their plans changed when a lyceum for noble children opened at Tsarskoye Selo. On the protection of friends the Pushkins placed their 12-year-old son in an elite institution. Initially it was intended to prepare children of the imperial family and their peers for higher civil ranks. But the status of the Lyceum lowered. Pushkin studied in a privileged and closed institution, but among the equals of the children of impoverished families. Within the walls of the Lyceum, many became close friends. 3 friends, Ivan Pushkin, Anton Delvig, Wilhelm Kuchelbecker, remained friends of Pushkin for life. The Lyceum was taught by the famous lawyer Alexander Kunitsyn, philosopher Alexander Gallic and philologist Nikolai Koshansky. It was the professors who had a great influence on the intellectual and moral development of the Lyceum pupils. Their relatives could only visit their children on weekends. On weekdays the lessons started at 7 a.m. and lasted until late at night. During his studies Alexander Pushkin saw his alma mater as a monastery, and dreamed of freedom, which would come with the graduation from the Lyceum. Pushkin did not study very well, especially hard for the young writer were given logic and mathematics. With a brilliant memory he lacked diligence and attention. However, the teachers noted the erudition of pupils. In the Lyceum, he continued to read and write many texts in French. Lyceum student Sergei Komovsky recalled that because of his love for this language Pushkin was called, in mockery, the Frenchman, and by the physique and some habits of the monkey and even a mixture of monkey and tiger. In Russian, Alexander Pushkin composed small epigrams and messages, and outlined the structure of his future autobiography. The young author was so fond of literary creation that the ideas of works were born one after another for several months ahead. Yesterday I wrote the third chapter of Fat Ham, or The Mind of Man. I began a comedy, I do not know whether I will finish it. On the third day I wanted to write an ironic poem, Igor and Olga. In the summer I will write a picture of Tsarskoye Selo. Pushkin wrote poems. In 1814 he first published one of them, to a friend, poet, under the pseudonym of Alexander N. K. S. P. in the magazine Herald of Europe. The first major success awaited Pushkin in 1815 during the winter translation exam. 15-year-old high school student read his poem Memories of Tsarskoye Selo. Gavril Derzhavin was present at the exam. He was shocked by a creation of a young poet. Pushkin later wrote, "I do not remember how I finished my reading, I do not remember where I ran away." Derzhavin was delighted, he demanded me, wanted to embrace me. I was looked for, but could not find. Pushkin's service and career. In 1817 Alexander Pushkin graduated from the Lyceum. In terms of academic achievement he was 24th out of 29 graduates. Pushkin was sent to the College of Foreign Affairs, official X class. But it was only listed, civil service is little attracted to the young man. After 6 years of study Pushkin plunged into the social life of the capital and, as a famous and distinguished author, joined the St. Petersburg Society of Writers. While still in the Lyceum he became a member of the literary circle Arzamas, which fought against the archaic linguistic traditions. In 1819 Pushkin joined the Literary and Theatrical Society, the Green Lamp, under the Decembrist Union of Welfare. Its members promoted freedom-loving ideas. At the meetings, they recited poems, discussed theater premieres, criticized journalistic articles. Here were conducted not only secular disputes, but also political conversations. All this was reflected in Pushkin's work. He wrote several epigrams on the statesmen of the time, the Ode, Liberty, the poems, To Tsarskoye, and The Village. These sharp political works provoked the wrath of Alexander I, and the emperor decided to send Pushkin to Siberia or to the Solovetsky monastery. However, Nikolai Karamzin interceded for the poet. The service of Pushkin was transferred from the capital to the south. Before his departure, in 1820, Alexander Pushkin finished his poem Ruslan and Ludmilla. Vasily Zhukovsky highly appreciated this work and gave the poet his portrait with the signature, "To the victorious pupil from the defeated teacher." South. In the spring of 1820 Alexander Pushkin went to Kishinev, in the office of the chief trustee of the southern region. On the way to the new place of service the poet became very ill. To improve his health, Pushkin went first to the Caucasus, then, in the Crimea. Traveling impressions of the south of the empire was later reflected in some of his works. Finally, in September 1820 Pushkin arrived in Kishinev. The new Chief Lieutenant General Ivan Inzov related to the service of his subordinate indulgently and did not assign him any official matters. Pushkin used his time as he pleased, he communicated with members of the Union of Welfare, joined the Masonic Lodge, Ovid. In his spare time, he still wrote. During this period appeared The Prisoner of the Caucasus, Gavriliada, The Robber Brothers, The Fountain of Bakhchisarai, The Song of Oleg the Vesham. Pushkin also began work on the novel in verse, Eugene Onegin. At this time in St. Petersburg began to come out the poet's books, Ruslan and Ludmilla, The Prisoner of the Caucasus, The Fountain of Bakhchisarai. They also began Pushkin's professional activity. He was the first writer in Russia who began to earn money by literary work. In 1823 Pushkin moved to Odessa. Here he got a job in the office of Count Vorontsov. Soon, however, official and personal conflicts led Pushkin to ask for his resignation. Vorontsov is a vandal, a court boor and a petty egoist. He saw me as a collegiate secretary, and I confess that I think of myself something else. I will remove myself from evil and do good, I will quit my job and start rhyming. Alexander Pushkin. Meanwhile in Moscow in 1824 the police opened Pushkin's letter. He wrote to Kuchelbecker about his passion for atheistic teachings. For such statements the poet threatened not just retirement. Pushkin was sent to a real exile in the family estate in the village of Mikhailovskoye in Pskov province. The south, after all, was passed off as a forced mission. The writer was deprived of a modest salary, supervision was established, and the end of his sentence was not marked in any way. Pushkin in Mikhailovskoye. In Mikhailovskoye Pushkin led a secluded life. His parents, along with his sister Olga and brother Leo, left the estate, so that the exile did not adversely affect the family. The poet was initially happy with the peace and quiet, but with the onset of autumn coldness depressed. The only entertainment for Pushkin was talking with his nanny Irina Rodionovna. Her tales, as the poet said, corrected the shortcomings of the French upbringing. He wrote down the plots of magical stories, and later used them in his works. The reclusive way of life did not become destructive for Pushkin, rather the opposite. The writer read a lot, worked, reflected on his work. In the first autumn of Mikhailovsky he began to write Boris Godunov. This tragedy was an important stage in the work of the poet. He moved from romanticism with its heroics to a realistic embodiment of the characters. Following Shakespeare's example, I limited myself to depicting epics and historical faces, not chasing after stage effects, romantic flashes, etc. Alexander Pushkin. The exoticism and abstraction were gone from the poet's work, and contemporary realities came to the fore. Having completed his tragedy, Pushkin wrote to Prince Pyotr Vyazemsky, "My tragedy is over, I have read it aloud, alone, and was beating my hands and shouting, 'Oh yes Pushkin, oh yes son of a bitch.'" Pushkin finished the poem, To the Sea, he had begun in Odessa, resumed work on his autobiographical notes, and wrote a mock poem, Count Nulin. I myself want to publish. On December 1, 1825 Alexander I died. The emperor left no heirs, and the presumed emperor Constantine, the next oldest brother, abdicated the throne. Nikolai Pavlovich became the pretender to power. Members of the Northern Secret Society decided to take advantage of the interregnum. On the morning of December 26, an uprising was scheduled. The participants planned to take troops to Senate Square and force the senators to sign a manifesto to the Russian people on the convening of the Constituent Assembly instead of swearing to Nicholas. A constitutional monarchy or republic was to be established in Russia. However, the coup attempt failed. Pushkin learned about the Decembrist uprising while in exile. The investigation of the case did not promise anything good. The poet's poems were found at all of those arrested. The writer had to give a receipt that he was not in secret societies, of their existence did not know. Pushkin, though worried about his situation, but hoped that the new emperor would forgive him and release him from exile. I have already written to the Tsar, immediately at the end of the investigation, concluding my petition with your exact words. I am waiting for a reply, but I have little hope. Rebellion and revolution have never pleased me, it is true, but I have been in touch with almost everyone and in correspondence with many of the conspirators. All the outrageous manuscripts went under my name, as all the lewd ones went under Barkov's. If I had been demanded by the commission, I would of course have been excused, but I was left alone, and it does not seem to be for good. However, who knows? From a letter of Alexander Pushkin to Prince Pyotr Vyazemsky. The first collection, Alexander Pushkin's Poems, was published in 1826. It was a huge success, the volume was sold out in several weeks. This year Pushkin wrote the following chapters of Eugene Onegin, but did not hurry to publish them, as well as other works. In response to the publisher Peter Pletnev, he sharply replied, I myself want to publish or give out in the light, that is, be released from exile. September 20, 1826 Pushkin was summoned to an audience with Tsar Nicholas I. After the brutal reprisals against the Decembrists, the emperor wanted to win over society, so he returned from exile, a favorite of all the famous poet. The monarch not only released Pushkin, but guaranteed the highest patronage and offered to become his personal censor. After a conversation with Nicholas I, the writer hoped to be completely free to create. But the Tsar had other plans. Pushkin was to become a poet at court. Revolution in the stylistics and vocabulary of Russian literary language. At the time of Sasha's birth, the Pushkin family of noble birth was about 700 years old. Was it not this feeling of personal involvement in history that moved him to a revolution in the stylistics and vocabulary of the Russian literary language? He rid it of an excess of foreign borrowings and cumbersome verbal constructions, made it close and understandable to ordinary people, and then made the aristocrats speak it. In prose Pushkin also did not express himself, but wrote in simple human language. Before Pushkin, writers, as well as readers, could not dream of such a natural and expressive description of experiences. In Russia it was Pushkin who pioneered realism in all major literary genres, including drama. He allowed not to hide his heroes' flaws and weaknesses. In the literature entered the images of the little man, station master, undertaker, serfs. The tales of the late Ivan Petrovich Belkin, a cycle consisting of 5 novels, The Shot, Blizzard, The Undertaker, Station Ranger, The Peasant Baroness. The first completed work in prose. Pushkin's personal life. In 1829 at one of the balls Alexander Pushkin met Natalia Goncharova. The girl at that time was 16 years old, while the poet, almost 30. The first beauty of Moscow immediately captivated Pushkin, and a few months later he made a proposal to Goncharova. But her mother referred to the girl's young age and did not give her consent at once. The distraught writer left Moscow for his brother in the Caucasus, where the war was going on at the time. When I saw her for the first time, her beauty was just beginning to be noticed in society. I fell in love with her, I got dizzy, I asked for her hand. Your answer, with all its vagueness, almost drove me mad, the same night I left for the army. You will ask me why. I swear, I cannot say myself, but an involuntary longing drove me from Moscow, I could not bear your and her presence there. From a letter of Alexander Pushkin to his mother Natalia Goncharova. Pushkin wrote a cycle of poems in the Caucasus, dedicated to this land. The Caucasus, on the hills of Georgia lies the night gloom. Landslide, Delhi Bash, and The Monastery on Kazbek. In 1830 the writer returned to Moscow and again proposed to Natalia Goncharova. This time the parents blessed the couple. However, the wedding prevented the fact that Pushkin had no property. Then the poet's father allocated to his son part of the family estate Boldino in Nizhny Novgorod province, the village of Kistanivo, together with 200 peasants. In the summer of 1830 Pushkin went there to settle legal matters. Pushkin's Don Juan list and love poems. Pushkin's so-called Don Juan list was compiled before his marriage in the album of Elizabeth Ushakova. It counted 37 names from Agrafena to Catherine 1, 2, 3 and even 4, but it was not a diary of his alcove victories, a list of women who delighted the poet. The poet often dedicated poems to his lovers and did not hesitate to sign them when he was single. Alina. Have pity on me. I dare not demand love. Perhaps for my sins, my angel, I am not worth love. But pretend. This look can express everything so wonderfully. A poem of confession, dedicated to Alexandra, the stepdaughter of Pushkin's neighbor in the village of Mikhailovskoye, landlady Praskovia Osipova. Pushkin long hesitated to give the poem to the girl with whom he was passionately in love. Boldin Autumn. The writer expected to stay in Boldino for no more than a month, but a cholera epidemic changed his plans. It was impossible to leave the village, so the writer spent 3 months here. Entry to Moscow was forbidden, and here I was locked up in Boldino. I am completely ruined and, really, I do not know what to do. Clearly there can be no wedding this year, damn him. No neighbors, no books. The weather is terrible. I spend my time rubbing paper and getting angry. From a letter of Alexander Pushkin to Natalia Goncharova. Boldin Autumn is a period of unprecedented creative flight. In Boldin Pushkin finished Eugene Onegin, wrote The Tale of the Late Ivan Petrovich Belkin, The Story of the Village Goryukin, Little Tragedies, Drama Mermaid, Poem House at Kolomna, and many poems. Pushkin returned to Moscow in December 1830, and a few months later married Natalia Goncharova. The poet dreamed of solitude, a quiet family life and quiet work on books. However, his wishes were not destined to come true. The Duel and the Poet's Death. In 1831 Alexander Pushkin was hired as a historiographer to write the history of Peter. But the writer was more fascinated by the biography of the rebel Yemelyan Pugachev. Pushkin planned to create an epic novel about this era. First, he gathered information in the archives, then traveled to the areas of the Pugachev rebellion, the Volga and the Urals, to reliably describe the events of the time. After the expedition, Alexander Pushkin went to Boldino. On his family estate he worked on a scholarly work, The History of Pugachev, wrote The Bronze Horseman, Angelo, The Queen of Spades, The Tale of the Fisherman and the Fish, and The Tale of the Dead Tsarevna and the Seven Bogaders. The second Boldin Autumn was twice as short as the previous one, but no less productive for Pushkin. Nicholas I bestowed upon Pushkin a junior court rank, the rank of Gentleman of the Bedchamber. Now the four Pushkins could officially invite the court balls. This position the poet considered insulting for his age. The writer wanted to reject the new title, but had to put up with it. Friends, Veligorsky and Zhukovsky, had to pour cold water over the new chambermaster, so he, Pushkin, was thrilled by this award. If it were not for them, he, being beside himself, bursting into flames, with flaming face, wanted to go to the palace and talk rudeness to the king himself. Pavel Nashchikin, a friend of the poet. In the 1830s Pushkin wrote only realistic works. But his contemporaries were not ready for the new literary direction, which described social inequality, historical phenomena and other complex aspects of life. Fellow writers did not accept the new works of the writer. In court circles he also did not meet the support. In St. Petersburg there was gossip about Pushkin's wife and her admirers. The poet received anonymous letters. The poet could not remain cold-blooded and put up with insulting rumors. February 8, 1837 Alexander Pushkin had a duel with Georges Dantes, the main intrigue, defaming the reputation of Natalia Pushkina. During the duel the poet was seriously wounded and died 2 days later. Alexander Pushkin was buried on the territory of Sviatogorsky Monastery in Pskov province. Interesting facts. After Pushkin's death, Nicholas I established a 25-year period of ownership of the heirs of the writer on his works, then the term was extended for another 25 years. This decision on copyright helped Pushkin's heirs, but damaged the writer's legacy. His books were published rarely. In 1887, 50 years after Pushkin's death, any publisher could print his works without paying anything. When Alexei Sovereign published his first 10-volume book the same year, readers literally swept away the counter and sold out all the copies. Alexander Pushkin loved to gamble. Even in his Lyceum years the writer was addicted to cards. He saw in them the poetry of risk, a test of fate. The most popular game of the time, bank or stos, he praised in the Queen of Spades. Later he wrote proudly in his diary, "My Queen of Spades is in great fashion. Players pontificate on the 3, 7 and ace." Pushkin played usually unsuccessfully. Before the southern exile of 1820, he staked the manuscript of his first collection of poems and lost. He managed to buy it back and publish it only a few years later. Pushkin later staked his unpublished works. Pushkin lost all the money he had. He offered, as a wager, the 5th chapter of Onegin, which he had just finished. The bet was accepted, since this manuscript was also money, and very large. Pushkin received 25 rubles in assignations per line, and Pushkin lost. The next bet was a pair of pistols, but here the luck took the poet's side. He won back both the pistols and the manuscript, and also 1,500. Nikolai Kichiev. The poet had a fiery temper. He challenged his opponents to a duel and always carried a gun. Writer's comrade Alexander Veltman wrote that Pushkin immediately after awakening trained marksmanship and shot from a gun at the wall, sitting naked in bed. Then the recreational weapon was replaced by a 7-kilogram metal cane for the hardness of his hand when shooting. Ivan Liprandy recalled, "I knew Alexander Sergeevich to be passionate, sometimes to the point of tempers, but in a moment of danger. Pushkin possessed the highest degree of equanimity. When it came to the barrier, he was as cold as ice." For example, Pushkin came to his duel with Alexander Zubov with cherries and he ate them while his opponent was aiming at the writer. When Zubov missed, Pushkin refused to shoot back. This episode later became the basis of the story, The Shot. However, in his attire Pushkin often went to extremes. For example, a merchant's son Ivan Lapin wrote in his diary about a meeting with Pushkin at the Sviatogorsk fair in 1825, somehow surprised his strange clothes. For example, he had a straw hat on his head, wearing a chintz red shirt, girded with a blue ribbon, with an iron cane in his hand, with pre-long black sideburns that looked more like a beard, also with pre-long fingernails, with which he peeled the shell in oranges and ate them with great appetite, I think, about a dozen. The writer grew long fingernails after high school. He kept them that way all his life. They are clearly visible in his portrait of Orest Kaprensky. To the longest of the nails did not break, Pushkin wore a thimble. While working on The History of Pugachev, Pushkin visited the village of Burdy, Orenburg province, where the rebels' headquarters was. Here the writer interviewed eyewitnesses of the peasant war about the impostor. The Cossacks were perplexed as to why the visiting man questioned them with such passion about the robber and also paid for their story. They decided that the stranger was inciting them to revolt and denounced him. About this Vladimir Dahl, who traveled at the time with Pushkin, recalled, "Yesterday, some strange gentleman came, the signs, a small man, black hair, curly, swarthy face, and incited Pugachevskina and gave gold, must be the Antichrist, because instead of nails on his fingers claws." Pushkin laughed a lot about it.